Rationale. The past 20 years have witnessed a global rise in public sector managerialism and the emergence of sophisticated systems of performance management. Debate hindered by a lack of consensus over terminology, and by a tendency to gloss over contextual differences. Nonetheless, there is now a widespread, though uncontested, belief that educational institutions function better if the performance of employees is systematically managed. In this chapter, it starts examining the history of appraisal in England and Wales. It then considers the inherent tension between evaluative and developmental appraisal, and between the needs of the individual and the demands of the institution. It argues that the power of dynamics underlying any form of appraisal need to be acknowledged and addressed because the potential for abuse exists at both ends of the spectrum. In certain contexts, underperforming staff may be able to avoid censure indefinitely, shortchanging colleagues and students alike, whereas in other contexts, Machiavellian leaders may be able to remove subordinates for no other reason than personal spite. This latter situation is explored through two case studies from United Arab Emirates (UAE), where sponsorship laws provide expatriate employees with virtually no protection against instant dismissal. What then becomes clear is that the success or failure of any appraisal system depends on the internal ethos of the institution and the external conditions of employment within which the appraisal system operates. Appraisal and public sector managerialism. The emergence of appraisal had been linked to global policy agendas that call for more efficient and accountable public services. Walsh 1988 et.al. An unstable and uneven, but apparently unstoppable flood of closely interrelated reform ideas that is permeating and reorienting education systems in diverse social and political locations, which have very different histories. The key elements of the education reform package are embedded in three interrelated policy technologies: the market, managerialism and performativity. Paul 2003. Steering from a distance, educational institutions are seemingly given greater autonomy and decision-making powers, but are simultaneously constrained by the policy context. UK's 1988 Education Reform Act example, on the other hand, state schools are allowed to control a much greater percentage of their own budgets and employ their own staff directly rather than relying on a local authority. Yet on the other, central control is exercised covertly through a system of checks and balances to which all state schools must submit. In England, it includes a national curriculum specifying content and national strategies specifying pedagogy. Schools and colleges can choose how to act, but this freedom is severely restricted by government policies create a quasi-market for education and mold public expectations in particular directions. Polit 1993. Clark and Newman 1997. Direct central regulation is reduced, but the centre determines the rules of the game, the forms and limits of what can be achieved, so that the system institution is steered by remote control. Marginson 1997, 65. Although this trend is evident all over the world, appraisal is not the same everywhere. Its precise aims, processes and instruments differ from institution to institution, depending on the organizational culture and the national context. Townley, 1993 et al. Appraisal in England and Wales. 1833. Althorp Act introduced the first school inspections. Brighouse 1995, cited in Shaw et al. 2003. This were not intended as a means of exercising control, but of affording assistance. Shuttleworth 1839, quoted in Shaw et al. 2003. 1862. Revised Code introduced a far more draconian system in which elementary teachers were paid according to the attendance rates and test scores of their students. In 1926, such payment by results was abolished, again for political reasons, and teachers were once more observed by inspectors whose function was to disseminate good practice. At this point, state schooling moved from an essentially visible, prescriptive and centralized system to an essentially invisible and diffuse mode. Grace 1985. 11. By 1950s, teachers had become trusted, autonomous professional. Trope. 1957. 4 factors prompted the public after 2 decades. Right-wing educationalists published series of damning pamphlets between 1969 and 1977. It called black papers, criticized progressive education, and persuaded the public that teachers were responsible for declining academic standards and rising illiteracy, violence and indiscipline. The economic crisis of 1973-5 raised questions about how well schools prepared students for the workplace. The controversy at William Tyndale Junior School over the use of progressive teaching methods triggered demands for more centralized control. Davis 2002. A speech by James Callaghan, the then Prime Minister at Ruskin College, Oxford, in 1976 called a national debate among both educationalists and non-educationalists about how best to prepare students for the workforce. Callaghan 1976. The purpose of appraisal, development or evaluation. Purposes. Accountability. Peak 1986. Goddard and Emerson 1992. Efficiency-driven performance assessment. Polit 987. Managerial control. Control-oriented appraisal. Walsh 1988. Managerial appraisal. Hutchinson 1997. Focuses. Improvements. Peak 1986. Participative appraisal. Walsh 1988. Professional development. Polit 1987. Author's arguments is that people are unlikely to be honest about their weaknesses and future aspirations if this information can then be used to determine their chances of promotion or their next pay rise. To overcome this difficulty, go further by recommending the use of different data collection tools at different times with different people. In order to maintain minimum standards of competence, all teachers must be subjected to occasional summative assessment using a craft model of teaching, with its emphasis on a repertoire of specialized techniques and knowledge. Formative assessment using professional and art models of teaching should prevail, so that teachers can enhance their ability to provide creative, individualized learning experiences for all. IBID 56-60. Appraisal is extremely time-consuming, particularly for the appraiser, and the outcomes rarely justify the amount of time involved. Others believe that appraisal can never be entirely non-evaluative because appraisers inevitably make judgments about what they see. Even if these are never voiced, they will still exert an influence over subsequent event. Teachers, principals and administrators in two southern U.S. states all saw appraisal as having 2 functions, improvements and accountability, that were entirely compatible, even interdependent. Peak 1986. Similarly, 99% of the New Zealand Fitzgerald's 2001 survey suggested appraisal should include elements of both professional development and accountability. Middlewood 2001, the figure among school teachers in the English Midlands was 90%. The focus of appraisal, the individual or institution. The twin purposes of appraisal, development and/or evaluation are mirrored by twin foci, the individual and/or institutions, with similar debates about the extent to which the two are complementary. Much of the literature suggests that the desires of individual teachers and the demands of their educational institutions can and should be integrated. Rutherford 1992. Appraisal must be for the benefit of both the individual and organization. Poster and Poster 1997, 152. Empirical studies frequently reveal appraisal schemes that focus on individual professional development without reference to institutional goals. Collins, 1997, 181, clearly viewed appraisal as serving to promote their personal, professional development without any mention of the larger aim of improving the quality of educational provision in school. Likewise, in higher education, Hughes, 1998, found that appraisal in most of the 75 universities and colleges in his survey focused on the individual, thereby ignoring its strategic potential to improve whole departments. Not linking individual professional development to institutional goals is clearly wasteful of resources, but not linking individual performance to institutional constraints is simply unjust. A fair appraisal cannot ignore the conditions under which an individual works. Yet all too often, the appraiser is also the appraisee's line manager and, as such, partly responsible for the appraisee's working environment. It is easier for the appraiser to blame the teacher's incompetence than admit to providing poor leadership or insufficient resources. Post and Poster, 1997, 154. Draw a 4 matrix to illustrate how the purpose and focus on appraisal might interact, depending on the priorities and climate particular institution, so as to produce appraisal that is managerial, judgmental, developmental or laissez-faire. The impact of appraisal on teaching quality. Much of the literature says that the primary of appraisal must be to improve learning outcomes, Feidler and Cooper 1992, or at least teaching quality, Magenis 1993. This is an ambitious aim, given how difficult it is to measure learning outcomes, let alone demonstrate causality between improved achievement and particular forms of classroom practice. It is also at odds with much empirical research. Studies by Turner and Cliff, 1988, and Winstanley and Stuart Smith, 1996, both found no evidence that appraisal results in improved performance. Likewise, the 3-year study of 1,000 English schools previously mentioned found that few teachers changed their classroom practice as a result of appraisal, Raggett EL Doc 2004. Case Studies, Appraisal and Teaching in Rehab and Alfana. 1. Used of detailed post-lesson debrief. 2. Used student evaluation of teaching, set. Teachers helping their student to become happy than to learn. 3. Appraisal system had no impact. The result of the study implies that even they used different context in teaching the students as well as the teacher provide them appraisal still had no impact to both students and teacher. Teachers focused on the happiness of their students because of their fear that student might complain. Shortly, the study had no insignificant impact upon classroom behavior to both students and teachers. The impact of appraisal on dismissal. Appraisal. Fair and robust performance appraisal regime which recognizes success but also acts on failure, FE 1997, 49. Dismissal. UK school teachers were dismissed due to incompetence, Raggett et al. 2004. Non-renewal of contracts. Case Studies, the impact of appraisal on dismissal at Rehab and Alfana. Appraisal operates on the basis of reactions to their opinions and ideas, and not simply to how well they do their job. There are political purposes, manipulative purposes, there are organizational systematic things that don't fit on the line. Conclusion. The primary purpose of appraisal is to enhance communication about work performance so that appraisers and appraisees have a shared understanding of the aims, purposes and goals of the organizations. Appraisees should receive valuable feedback about their contribution through the year. Appraisers should come to understand the issues and concerns hindering full effectiveness. Appraisal conversations should be positive and developmental, and should celebrate and affirm the appraisee's role in the organization. Steps to ameliorate any concerns identified through the appraisal process should be considered and planned. It is important that the individual's role and work is reviewed in the context of the wider organization and their own professional development. Poor performances should not be ignored, but it is best dealt with through separate conduct and capability procedures. Should a conduct or capability issue emerge from the appraisal process, the appraised should be informed immediately. Managers should initiate appropriate steps, including target setting and monitoring, within the instructions' relevant procedures. Healthy organizations do not muddle discipline and development. Thank you.